Thanks so much for having me here tonight. It's such a pleasure to be here as part of the inaugural Red Talk. I've been asked to speak to you tonight a little about my journey with Red Cross, but also the area I work in, which is International Humanitarian Law, or the laws of war, a really important set of rules that protect people and places like schools and hospitals in times of armed conflict. So I started volunteering for Red Cross about 8 years ago when I was working as a commercial litigation lawyer. I didn't sign up to work in international humanitarian law. I actually answered an ad for our telecross service. So people who would be rostered on once a fortnight to call up isolated elderly Australians between 7 and 8 a.m. to check that they were okay. I have to say, it made a really welcome change from suing people for a living. So very early on, I was hooked. I had well and truly drunk the Red Cross Kool-Aid. I absolutely loved it. And I was fortunate enough that about 18 months later, I was offered a short-term contract as a junior member of the International Humanitarian Team. 6 years later, I haven't looked back, and I'm now the National Manager for International Humanitarian Law, Movement Relations and Advocacy at Australian Red Cross. And I also still volunteer with Red Cross, although these days I volunteer with another program, our Immigration Detention Monitoring Program, where I assist teams monitoring conditions and treatment of people held in offshore immigration detention facilities. So what do I do on a daily basis? Well, to be honest, that is kind of hard to say, and that's what I love about my job. The role of our team is to promote the laws of war across Australia to people that might need to use and understand these laws. So, for example, to Australian businesses working in conflict zones, to the Australian Defence Forces, foreign correspondents, humanitarian aid workers. We work with the Australian government around key priorities in international humanitarian law and how we can work together to really strengthen some of those laws. And we also talk to the general public more broadly within Australia about international humanitarian law on the basis that if you want these laws to be respected in times of conflict, they must be known and understood in times of peace, and that at their very core, these laws are about humanitarian values and a humanitarian spirit, which is what Red Cross is all about. Really importantly, another part of our role is to make sure Red Cross people, so staff, members, volunteers, supporters, understand what it means to be Red Cross and what it means, why and how we apply our 7 fundamental principles, which are all actually derived from international legal frameworks. My job's the sort of job where, I occasionally find myself having a little cry after reading a, harrowing report from the field about violence against women in war that we're using to draft how to protect women in law and how that law should be interpreted. Or it means negotiating with governments and my counterparts in Red Cross and Red Crescent national societies around the world and international conferences to strengthen protections for healthcare workers in war zones. It's meant working with my colleagues in Red Crescent national societies across the Middle East, in Jordan, and sitting down and talking about how we're responding to the humanitarian consequences of landmines and cluster munitions. I have to say it's sometimes a bit of a funny feeling to be at work and be discussing in great detail the legality of the use of nuclear weapons or why rape is now considered a war crime under international law, and then going home and talking to my neighbour about whether they should get a new dog or that the price of bananas is outrageous. It's a bit of a funny balance. Or coming home from really intense work trips and going straight to the pub to celebrate a birthday with a friend. I do sometimes get slightly incredulous or bemused looks from my friends now when they say, "Oh, what did you get up to last week?" And without hesitation, I'll launch into some very impassioned description of what I've done. And, it could be that, well, for 3 days I was at an army base on a military exercise with 30,000 Australian and American soldiers playing war games and teaching them how they'd interact with Red Cross in the field. Then I went to Canberra. I talked to some government lawyers about how we'd work together to strengthen protections for healthcare workers. Had a 3 a.m. teleconference with Geneva about how we'd try and push for a treaty to ban nuclear weapons. Then I went back to Melbourne to talk to a Probus club and then did some training to aid workers that were about to be deployed overseas, and then rounded out the week talking to some new volunteers about what it means to be part of our humanitarian movement. The next week I could just as easily spend several days at my desk, to my shame, working out how to read a budget. It's challenging, diverse work. I absolutely wouldn't change my job for anything. A big part of what I like so much about working in this area of law is really tied up in the fact that I'm doing it with and for Red Cross. Under international humanitarian law, we're given a really unique legal mandate. In the Geneva Conventions and their protocols, and being the nerdy lawyer that I am, I carry them around with me everywhere like a safety blanket. They're here with me always. I won't read them out to you page by page. But under these laws, the Red Cross movement is written throughout these laws, and it really creates that link between Red Cross, international humanitarian law, and the development and evolution of the services that we provide today. From these legal texts, statutes of the Red Cross have been developed, where governments have mandated us to promote the laws of war, to respond to disasters and emergencies, to reconnect families that have been separated by conflict and disasters. And it's really quite powerful to think that every government in the world has signed up to say that this is what we're meant to do, this is what we're a part of, and that we do all of this with regard to our 7 fundamental principles. And again, when I talk about these 7 fundamental principles, I'm not talking about a pretty corporate slogan. These are written into international legal frameworks that are agreed by all governments and oblige us to work in really particular ways, creating a link and consistency between us and every other member of the Red Cross around the world, over 190 of us. And I must say, for a lawyer, knowing that these things are written into a legal document is truly exciting. So, in terms of our fundamental principles, to know that we're working with the principle of humanity at the front of our mind in everything that we do, to alleviate human suffering wherever it might be found, to do this in a way that recognises that really important link that we have in international law and that link to our governments and to the public authorities in the humanitarian field, but always maintaining our independence from government, to prioritise our work according to the principle of impartiality, our non-discrimination clause essentially, that says we prioritise our work based on the urgency of people's needs, not based on religion, race or any other factor, that we work in a neutral way. We don't engage or insert ourselves into political conversations, but we work in a confidential way with everyone to ensure that our voices are really strongly heard and that we put our positions forward, but that we're able to enjoy the confidence of everyone so we can access the places and the people that need us most. And that will be an organisation that's open to everyone, with a core of volunteers as the backbone, making up a diverse cross-section of our community and working in solidarity with the rest of our movement. These principles sound great, I think, and I'm sure you would agree, and they sound easy and straightforward. The reality is that they're really, really hard. If you ask any of our staff at the coalface of our work, they'll say that the principles are deeply complex ideas and they're challenging, and sometimes they even go against our own immediate reactions to what we're seeing. But they're absolutely essential to us performing our work and maintaining the trust of everyone we work with around the world in a consistent way, consistent with each other as a movement, but also consistent in terms of our obligations under the Geneva Conventions. I guess you can tell from what I'm saying that I think being part of this movement is really, really special. To feel like such a community-based organisation in Australia, but also part of something that is so much bigger than ourselves. We're part of a movement that has 190 Red Cross and Red Crescent societies just like us. And it's phenomenal for me to think, little old me, I am part of a collection of people all around the world in over 100 countries that are all working our guts out to promote the laws of war in a way that's consistent with Red Cross. It's, I think, frightening, but also incredibly empowering for all of us, be you a volunteer in your local community or the CEO of Australian Red Cross, to know that when you open your mouth to speak as a Red Cross person, you have the credibility, the trust, the humanitarian voice, and 155 years of principled humanitarian action standing behind you, giving you that voice of Red Cross. So you're speaking, when you speak as Red Cross, you're speaking as a local volunteer organisation, but also as the largest, most diverse humanitarian network in the world. So now you know a little bit about what I do and what I like about it, but why do I do it in the first place? To be honest, why give up the resources, the money, the career security in a corporate law firm to work for peanuts in a department that can't afford to buy me a stapler? Well, I think to properly explain what I do, I need to go all the way back to the Second World War and to 2 women who I think really epitomise what Red Cross is all about and the power of Red Cross. The first woman I want to speak about is Valda Rowley, who was born in Melbourne, and when the Second World War broke out, she eagerly signed up to be a nurse with Red Cross. She actually was so enthusiastic that she lied about her age on her intake form so that she could be sent off overseas. But happily, she was a very terrible liar and she remained in Melbourne. But she spent almost 2 years tending for returned servicemen, both in hospital and later in rehabilitating traumatised men through excursions and activities. Her whole life has been dedicated in some form of voluntary service and helping others. Much of it, in fact most of it, through the Red Cross. Flip to the other side of the world in 1939 and we meet a very different woman, Natasha Soloveichik. Natasha was born and raised in Berlin in a very affluent and influential family who later sent her to boarding school in Switzerland. Natasha dreamed of being one of the first female international lawyers and was actually accepted to study international law, which was quite rare at the time. However, her studies were cut off midway through her first year because the Second World War broke out. She reunited with her family in Lithuania and soon found herself in a ghetto where all of her family perished. Later, she was transported to a concentration camp and she was finally forced to march out of the camp and across Eastern Europe by the German forces. Falling into the snow, Natasha, by this point in her early 20s, fell into a coma in a barn, finally at peace with the world. 4 weeks later, she opened her eyes to find herself in a field hospital filled with civilians who had experienced the worst that humanity has to offer. She owed her life to medical professionals bearing that universal symbol of protection, the Red Cross. She later also reunited with some extended family through the amazing network of the Red Cross Tracing Service and ultimately migrated out to Australia with her husband and about $50 to her name. Both women still make regular donations to Australian Red Cross and the organisation holds a special place for both of them, albeit in very different ways. You're probably wondering why I'm telling you about these very different and seemingly irrelevant stories. Well, I'm telling you because this is where my own Red Cross story starts. Not with telecross volunteering, not with my mother who used to work for Red Cross in community services. It's with Natasha and Valda, my two grandmothers, and their experiences with Red Cross during times of absolutely unimaginable suffering that has driven me to work as an international lawyer for the same organisation to which one has dedicated so many years of her life and to which the other has seen in action in the darkest moments of hers. To be honest, I'm pretty sure by the time I was born, Red Cross was probably tattooed across my heart and coursing through my veins. Even all these years on, it still really gives me goosebumps to think that the emblem my grandmother saw as medics literally nursed her back to life is the same emblem that I'm responsible for protecting 80 years later here in Australia. I'm sorry, I'm getting slightly emotional, but I don't usually talk about personal things in front of so many people. It's such an incredible honour to say that I am a very tiny cog, but I am nonetheless a cog in an enormous global humanitarian movement that's pushing, jostling, pressuring governments around the world to protect medical workers so that they can tend to the wounded and sick in armed conflict, so that medical workers can attend to people like they did to my grandmother Natasha, and so Red Cross volunteers all around the world can continue similar work to that my other grandma Valda was able to do. To promote the laws of war that were so, to be honest, so woefully and spectacularly inadequate in protecting my own family, but to see the progress that has been made over so many years and to fight to make sure that they are respected and recognised every day. To promote the work that we do in armed conflict and the body of law that allows us to search and reunite families separated by conflict. The same service that reconnected disparate parts of my family when it felt like everything had been lost. It's a job that energises me. It makes me feel part of something that is so much bigger than myself. And in a way, it makes me feel like my family's really sort of come full circle. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for the Red Cross's work during times of war, and I'm really proud to now dedicate my professional life to others who are caught up in armed conflict through my work with Red Cross, albeit in very humble ways. And I think also just feel incredibly privileged to be able to work as an international lawyer in public international law, which was something that my grandmother and so many other people around the world would love to do, but can't because conflict or disaster breaks out. We've come such a long way in 100 years, but to be honest, I am just really excited to see what the next 100 years has in store for us. And I can only imagine what it will look like with a new generation of Red Cross people, like many of you here tonight at the helm, guiding it through whatever challenges face us. And I know there will be people like Natasha, like Valda, like myself, who will be thanking you from the bottom of their hearts for whatever you're able to contribute to this amazing organisation. Thank you.